Okay, everyone, this is our last lecture. So hopefully putting it all together, we're going to talk about systems thinking and the One Health concept or paradigm. So this is going to be a relatively brief lecture, and I'm just going to jump right into it. Let's talk about systems thinking first. So systems thinking is often positioned as opposed to reductionist thinking. Now, reductionist thinking, otherwise known as the scientific method in many ways, has been a huge pinnacle of achievement in human civilization and has made extraordinary positive impacts on our well-being and our health. So much of science and medicine over the years has focused on reductionist thinking. What you do is you isolate the one variable and see how changing that changes the outcome, right? So that you can determine causation, so that you can see if a potential treatment actually works or if there was some other random factor at play. So, for example, the randomized controlled trial is the pinnacle of reductionist thinking, where you want to make sure that you have two groups that are alike in every single way possible, except that for one of them, you're going to do a particular intervention, and for the other one, you're usually going to give them a placebo, right? So that the only thing that's different is this one thing. So if that group that got the treatment does a much better than the other group, well, then you know the treatment actually works. And so this is really important and really powerful. But it's important to acknowledge that it's not sufficient, because in the real world, nothing works in isolation. Everything influences everything else. So while we need to understand the individual contributions of specific variables, we also then need to look at putting them all together. So that's what systems thinking is going to be about. So we're going to identify then how these different things interact and play out and how they impact each other. And it's important to acknowledge that a system is a group of interconnected parts that function as a whole. So I like the examples the book gave between kind of a system. You have all these different parts. They are oriented in specific ways. They relate to each other in specific ways, and they operate together as a unified whole, as opposed to, for example, heap, right? It could be the same exact parts, but if they're not positioned in relationship and there's no organizational structure to it, it doesn't work, right? And I think it was in Dr. Atul Gawande's TED Talk where he talked about you could have a Porsche, right? A really high performing sports car. Or you could have a collection of parts. And he talked about, you could have the best carburetor that's available and the best battery that's available, right? But they would be from all different cars, and you wouldn't even be able to put them together as a system. It wouldn't work. So how things relate to each other, how they function together is going to be exceedingly important. So we're going to outline and go through kind of the basic 6 steps that you want to incorporate when you're doing systems thinking. So the first one is to identify the key influences. And this is something that you learn by doing reductionist thinking, right? So what are the things that impact your outcome? What are the contributory causes? What are the determinants of health? What are the potential successful or effective therapeutic interventions, right? So what are the players? What are the things that are going to impact our outcome? So our key influences. And then, how powerful are they? What is their relative strength when it comes to how they impact the system? So, for example, if I'm looking at the health of a pregnant person, which is more important, that they stop smoking or that they take their prenatal vitamin every day, right? What are the relative strengths of those, and do they interact with each other, which would be the next step, right? So how does one thing impact the other, and does it? Because sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. And if they do impact each other, is it an additive thing or a subtractive thing or a synergistic thing. So remember when we talked about radon as a risk factor for lung cancer, for example, and smoking as a risk factor for lung cancer. So having a pretty high radon level in your house increases your risk of lung cancer about 4.5 times higher, to make it 4.5 times higher relative risk versus someone who doesn't. Smoking increases your risk by about 10 times. And so, but then the two of them together, it doesn't increase your risk by about 15 times. It increases your risk by about 40 times, right? So they come together and make it even so much more powerful. So we need to understand, is it additive or synergistic? And then we also need to understand not only how is it going to impact things right now at this moment, but then also how things change in time. And so that's going to lead us into the next 3 steps. Okay, so step 4 through 6 are these dynamic things, how things change, what particular options or opportunities for change exist. All right, so step number 4, we're going to look for feedback loops, things that tend to either further encourage the change or things that tend to inhibit the change. So both positive and negative feedback loops. So this has to do also with unintended consequences. So let's just think about a few examples. So kind of a complicated one is, so you might remember a while ago, for those of you who were here, there was required COVID testing for everybody who lived on campus, right, with a certain regularity. And so that required testing was so that we could identify people who had COVID and move them into isolation so that they wouldn't be able to infect other people. But an additional outcome of having regular required testing is also that then people were like, well, if I get infected, they're going to know because they're testing me regularly. And then I'm going to have to isolate and quarantine and do all that. And that's a big hassle. So I'm going to be more careful so that I'm less likely to get infected because I now know that they're going to catch me and I'm going to have these impacts that I don't want. So that also then serves to decrease the risk of COVID to everyone because then people start being more careful because they know you're going to be testing them. Right? So it's all these things that come together. So that's just one example. That one's a little convoluted, but relevant. Another one that you may be more familiar with is I feel better when I exercise regularly. My mood is better. I feel stronger. It's easier for me to go up the stairs at work, whatever it may be. So now, because I'm having these positive outcomes from exercising, I'm going to make it more of a priority and I'm going to exercise even more regularly, right? So that's a positive feedback loop where it just kind of builds on itself. Things can also operate in a not healthful way. So here's something else that you might have direct experience with. I'm already late for class, so I might as well just skip it all together, right? So it's like, well, this thing is already there, so I'm just gonna, right, and totally just let it go. So, one little thing can then have a significant impact, down the road. All right, so that was step 4, feedback loops. And then step 5 is bottlenecks. So what is holding things up? So when we've had all these supply chain issues in the last 6 to 9 months, one of the bottlenecks identified was the port in Los Angeles. So they just could not get the ships through. They couldn't get the containers offloaded, in part because the trucks were all backed up. So identifying those bottlenecks, those things that are hanging up change in the system or presenting an obstacle, and what are the ways that we can alleviate those bottlenecks. So one of the things that the government did was change some of the rules to devote some more resources to the port so they could operate 24 hours instead of just, I don't know how many they had been before, but it wasn't 24 hours. And they were able to start working through that backlog and alleviate that bottleneck. Another bottleneck that we talked about previously when we were talking about the health professionals is the nursing faculty shortage that exists in nursing programs. So one of the reasons why we don't have enough nurses isn't because there aren't enough people interested and talented enough to become nurses. It's because our nursing schools are a little bit smaller and can't take as many students as they otherwise could if we had more nursing faculty, right? So that's another bottleneck that we want to try to address. Sixth step is to look for leverage points. So these are opportunities at which some type of intervention or action is most likely to result in change or to be effective. So the book talks, for example, about when someone is pregnant. That is a great leverage point for getting them to stop smoking. It's also a great leverage point to get them to stop drinking alcohol if they're doing that as well, right? Because now it's not just about them, it's about the baby. So you have kind of this opportunity that you don't normally have to say, well, it's just not about you. There's another life here that's involved. And so oftentimes people are more open to change, more motivated to change during pregnancy, for example. So looking for those times when if you intervene, you are more likely to be successful. All right, so for putting this all together in action, instead of me kind of going through what the book does, I'm going to refer you to the section in the textbook. They have two excellent examples for coronary artery disease and for smoking cessation. All right, the next thing I want to talk about is visualizing the system. So we just talked about how there's all these different component parts and they're going to work together as a whole. And so we need to understand and be able to represent what all those parts are and how they all relate to each other. And I think the book did a terrible job. They hardly gave you any visualization at all. So I'm going to try to give you a little bit of one. I'm not a PowerPoint master in any way, shape, or form, so it's going to be a little rough. I apologize. I should have just drawn it out on paper and taken a picture, but let's give it a go. All right, so apologies for all the arrows. It's tough. The struggle's real. Okay, so let's create a system map, for example, for childhood mortality or deaths due to car accidents. So that's still one of the #1 killers of children in the United States is motor vehicle accidents or MVAs. So I put in orange because it's something we don't want, right? So let's understand what are the key influences, right? What are the things that contribute to these deaths? So on the one hand of things, because I'm a healthcare provider, I could look at, okay, on the healthcare side, what are the things, once an accident occurs, what are the things that you can do? What are the things that influence mortality rates? And I could do an epidemiologic study, right, and identify that rapid access to medical care can make a huge difference, can make a huge decrease. So you see the arrow with the minus. It can decrease childhood deaths. So you'll see it talked about in the textbook as the golden hour, for example. Getting people rapidly into care can make a huge difference, right? Because if they're in cardiac arrest, you want to resuscitate them. If they're bleeding, you want to control the bleeding and give them blood products or whatever else it may be. Getting access to care rapidly makes a big difference. So this is a very strong influence. So then I want to say, okay, well, what are the things that influence your rapid access to medical care, right? So what are the things that impact that? You have to have rapid EMS response, right? So EMS has to be able to get to the scene of the accident quickly so that they can administer first aid and kind of basic life support services. And then, well, what impacts EMS being able to get there quickly? Well, some influences for that could be some of those automatic EMS notification systems like the OnStar or even, have you seen that Apple Watch ad where people like use their watch then to call 911? So people being able to easily activate the 911 system, right? The other thing that's really important is that we have an adequate EMS service. So many of you are probably from small rural towns where the EMS service is usually just staffed entirely by volunteers. And during the COVID pandemic, I got to tell you, they've been really run ragged. We were having shortages of EMS workers ambulance folks, EMTs, even before the pandemic, and it's been really tough. There's also an additional challenge of if you're in a really remote area, you might be a 20 to 30 to 40-minute drive from the garage where the ambulance is located, right? So there's all kinds of things that go into that. Now, so that's the whole EMS side. What else is important for rapid access to medical care? Well, you want to have good quality care. They know what they're doing, right? So you want a highly trained trauma unit there in the emergency room when you arrive so that they can deliver definitive care and the care that you need rapidly. So that's kind of from the after the accident occurs. But we can also look at, okay, what are the things that lead to an accident itself? And can we, work on those influences, on those factors, right? So certainly distracted or other impaired driving is going to be one of the things that's going to increase the likelihood of childhood deaths from motor vehicle accidents. So what are the things that we can do to decrease that, right? So educational campaigns about texting would be one example. Technology that makes it harder for you to text when you're driving or impossible for you to text when you're driving. That's also another way to do this, and probably even more effective than educational campaigns for a lot of people. Drunk driving laws, right, are also important for this because any kind of impaired driving is going to be something we want to decrease. The other thing we can look at is unsafe pedestrian conditions. So how many times is the child a pedestrian in the accident? Do we need to look at our crosswalks? Do we need to look at our traffic signals? Do we need to look at our traffic patterns, right? So there's all these different things to come together. And so kind of creating that map of like, what are all the different things that can interact to influence this thing that we want to change can be really, really powerful. So as you work on your final reports, you might want to think about, gosh, could a system map be really helpful to show all the different factors that are going to be involved with this one particular outcome or condition that you're studying? So I want to give you an example of a bottleneck that has been successfully overcome in the example of having highly skilled medical response to, for example, a childhood trauma case, right? So a kid is in an accident and is brought into the emergency room, and you want to be able to deliver care to them as quickly as possible. Now, here is the challenge. Here is the bottleneck. Children come in lots of different sizes. So if you are a 12-pound infant versus a 2-year-old toddler versus a 5-year-old schoolgirl versus a 12-year-old, you are very different sizes. And so in medicine, for children, we have to base their medical doses, the doses of drugs that we give them, based on their body size, usually based on weight. So there is a huge bottleneck in that you'd have this terribly sick, injured, in extremis child in front of you, and you had to put them on a scale to figure out how much they weighed, and then the nurse had to calculate that, put that into her calculator for every drug you were going to order, and then be sure to draw up just that exact amount of the medication, be it epinephrine or whatever it was going to be. So this was a bottleneck. This took extra time, and it really delayed the ability to provide care rapidly in an emergency situation. So Broslow had this awesome idea, and he created Broslow tape. So what this is literally, it's just a big piece of paper. And what you do is you place the one end of it here at the head of the child. Here, make it easy. So this end at the head of the child, and then you see where their feet end up. And wherever their feet end up, there's going to be a color. And so usually the relationship between how long or how tall a child is and how much they weigh is relatively consistent. So you can get a ballpark idea of what the weight of the child is just by seeing how long they are on the table, right? So this, you just put it right on the stretcher, you see what color code they end up in, and then, isn't this brilliant? Here are all your medicines in the appropriate doses by color code, right? This is brilliant, right? This takes away so much delay in time. It takes away opportunity for human error, right? And it just simplifies and makes it easy to do the right thing, which should sound familiar to you. So if we want people to do certain things, we need to make those things easy to do. The easier we make it to make the right choice or to do the appropriate thing, the more likely people are going to do it. All right, so Breslow tapes are just brilliant. And it's just this cheap little piece of paper and then a medicine cart that's been organized by color, which codes to the different weights and therefore the different dosages of drugs. Brilliant. All right. So I want to talk about one other consideration, and it's in one of the videos in your media assignments. And I talk about this value per effort graph. And this has to do a little bit with leverage points, but it also has to do a bit with strategy as you're thinking about systems. And it also has to do when you're thinking about what are the things that are likely to be feasible and effective. So let me just walk you through a few things here. So on the y-axis here is value derived, right? So this is how much good you're able to do. And on the x-axis, it's how much effort and how much work it takes. So what you really want to do is you want to maximize the amount of value for the effort, okay? And you notice that after a certain amount of effort, sometimes you get a little tiny incremental improvement in value, but it's not really huge, right? So the difference between, say, I don't know, watching these lecture videos before you take the quizzes every week, right? Pretty good return on investment for the time and effort involved, right? As an example, just an idea, she says at the end of the course, right? So another way to think about this is kind of low-hanging fruit, right? So if I have an apple tree and I want to pick 6 apples, right, it would be really easy for me. I wouldn't need a ladder or anything to pick these 6, right? If I wanted to be difficult about it, I could say, no, I want to pick, these ones over here, but that would require a lot more effort for not any greater benefit in general. So that's where that idea of low-hanging fruit comes. Okay. So with all of that in mind, we're going to kind of bring everything to a close by talking about the One Health model or framework for looking at population health. Because really, of course, everything is interconnected. So I don't know if you've seen the ego versus eco graphic before. So we are one of many animals and life forms that inhabit this planet. And everything that we do impacts the other life forms as well as the natural environment and the physical environment around us, and that physical and natural environment affects us, right? So everything from the quality of the food we are eating, right, depends greatly on how we treat our soils. For example, the quality of the water that we drink depends greatly on how we are treating our air and our environment in general. So this is our only home, and we share it with a lot of other creatures. And in general, when the conditions are such that they are healthy, the conditions are usually such that we are more likely to be healthy as well. So the One Health Triad as an idea really came out of veterinary medicine, interestingly, kind of in 2 main ways. One is looking at animal husbandry and how do you promote the health of the animals without contaminating the environment and also protect the health of your workers. But it also comes from the field of zoonotic diseases, and zoonotic diseases are diseases that start in animals but can jump to humans, and can often cause a lot of havoc. So COVID-19, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, most likely jumped, we think, maybe from a bat to a pangolin, and then a pangolin to a human at one of the wet markets in China, where they have all these live exotic animals in cages, all in close proximity to each other and to humans. So our health and well-being is all entirely interconnected. And so one of the other videos you'll watch is looking at this kind of from an agricultural standpoint with in the Midwest, in the upper Midwest region, some folks over from Minnesota. So here's just one example of kind of that One Health mindset and thinking about how all of these things impact each other. So the book kind of goes through a couple of different examples, and one of them is ecosystem health and our physical environment. So I really want to highlight that one because I think for your generation, this is probably going to be the defining issue. So I think it's super important, so I wanted to highlight it. So one, we have this history of population migration. So you may remember from the smallpox video that massive migrations of Europeans to North America brought smallpox and then wiped out the population of the indigenous peoples who were living here at the time. So that has huge impacts on health when populations of people move around. It has huge impacts now, even just at baseline, because we are such a globalized world. We have people traveling all over all of the time. When COVID-19 erupted in Wuhan, China, it did not take it long at all to spread all over the entire world because we travel, we interconnect so much. There's so much movement of populations. There is also likely to be increased movement of populations, not only due to war and strife. So you look at the Syrian refugees, for example, when you look at all of the migrants coming from Central America to the United States trying to escape the really brutal conditions and corruption in their own home countries. But we're also anticipating, so the CIA and the Defense Department are anticipating massive migrations that will occur due to climate change and certain regions of the globe becoming uninhabitable, and as well as crop failures that are likely to occur due to changing weather systems. So population migrations are going to be a big factor. They already are, and they're going to become more so as people move around. Things can spread more easily. Then, of course, changes in food production and distribution. So we have done a lot of things over the last 50 years to make it easier and less expensive to feed people. But a lot of those things aren't actually particularly good for our environment, whether it's confined animal feeding operations or whether it's a lot of the practices in place for industrial level agriculture, which is stripping our topsoil. We have a lot of changes in how we produce food that have significant impacts on the health of the environment. So CAFOs, they're not necessarily good for the animals, and they generate all this waste, very concentrated manure, which then ends up entering the water streams and rivers and things of the areas that they are, and contaminate people's well water. Right? So that's a really real problem. Also, our food distribution system now is really kind of crazy. So I found this on social media the other day. I thought I'd share it. So this is one of those little packs of pears, right? Pears grown in Argentina, packed in Thailand, right? So then flown halfway across the world to be packaged in this plastic. And then in this case, the guy's from the UK. So then flown to the UK to be sold to the consumer. So this guy's like, Pears grow in the UK, right? I could grow them in my garden, walk outside, pick it, wipe it off, and eat it, right? And yet we have this huge system, which not only has environmental impacts in terms of our use of fossil fuels and our use of plastic, but also has impacts in terms of all the different places in that supply, distribution, production chain where there's opportunities for contamination, for example. So that's going to be important too. And for a third factor that they point out is land and resource use. So there are lots of things that we've done about how we use land, and resources too big for me to go into. But if I just focus on land for a little bit, suburbs and the creation of kind of what's called edge habitat between kind of meadows and lawns and woods, for example, are prime habitat for deer. And so because of all of our increase in suburban lives, that has increased the population of the deer, which has also then increased the likelihood of Lyme disease because the deer tick, right? Deer are part of that whole cycle. And so our risk for Lyme disease has gotten higher than it would have been because of how we use land. Of course, the way we use the land in terms of our agricultural fields for industrial scale, things that's stripping the topsoil, that has huge impacts. The fact that we develop waterfront land and that we fill in marshland and get rid of floodplains to build it up so that people can build hotels and houses and things on it has huge impacts for flood risk, all kinds of things, right? So really important impacts for our health. And then, of course, there's climate change, right, which is, kind of an overarching issue that is going to be big. It's going to be really big. And so how are we going to respond to, and the book has a nice table on many of the anticipated health challenges that will come with climate change. So everything from kind of longer tick seasons, expanded range for certain disease-carrying species of mosquitoes. So there's certain types of mosquitoes we don't usually have here in Wisconsin that can bring dengue and chikungunya and Zika and a bunch of other viruses. Those mosquitoes usually can't live up here, but that will change over time. So all kinds of things. And then, of course, the impact of just excess heat and increased frequency of severe weather events and severe droughts and resulting food insecurity that may occur. So there are going to be big issues ahead. So I'm glad you've taken this course and have started to think about all the different ways we can problem solve, ways to keep the population healthy. So this entire course has been about how can we achieve, how can we promote, how can we increase the likelihood that we will have a healthy population, right? So it's all about health at the population level. It's not about individual medical care of one individual person, right? So what factors in the built environment and in the natural environment promote or hinder health, right? So understanding contributory causes of disease and determinants of health, all of that, right? What are the things that tip the scales one way or the other in terms of is a population likely to be healthy and thriving? And then once we know what those influences are, and once we know how they relate to each other, how can we kind of support those things that promote health and disincentivize the things that don't? So thinking about our different ways of coming up with recommendations and how we implement those, keeping in mind that those kind of spectrums of things, and then all the ethical policy and law characteristics that kind of come into that. So the whole goal of public health is to achieve a healthy population. So hopefully in this course you've learned a bit about the ways that we can understand the influences and how they relate to each other, and then design systems that will support a healthy population. All right. Okay, everyone, that brings us to the end of the recorded lectures for this course. I thank you for all of your work throughout, and I hope that you've learned a lot from your quiz responses. It looks like many of you definitely are, which is awesome. I'm excited for all the new knowledge and skills that you're going to be able to take forward with you in your life, and hopefully a better appreciation of those things that are at work behind the scenes to help facilitate health. So a few things, you have a final report to submit. So don't forget to get that in and get it in on time. You are also welcome to submit them early. I'm really looking forward to you putting everything all together and showing me how much you've learned by applying concepts from each unit to whichever topic you have selected. I am here for you. If you want assistance or feedback, please reach out. I want to help you to create something that you feel really good and proud of. And whatever's next for you, I wish you all the best. So again, be sure to get your final report in by the deadline. Let me know if you have any questions. Thank you for all your work this semester, and I wish you great things. Take care.